let's roll right into our discussion. So for today, we're going to again be talking about authentically living your mission. I want to say that I am the moderator, but by no means an expert in this area. In fact, I'm so excited to have four really talented leaders in our community here today to lead us through some of these issues, but also some of those promising practices that they've experienced here in the region. For you, if you want to ask a question, what we're asking you to do is just throw it in the chat. Cindy Lawfer, my colleague, will be keeping track of those as they come in, and she'll be playing sort of the traffic police duty of putting them together. If there's a question about your meaning of your question, so it wasn't completely clear to Cindy, she may ping you back and say, oh, could you help me understand this or that? We're going to do about 50 minutes of work at the beginning, and then we're going to turn it loose for all of your questions. And we really would love for you to use the chat so that we can make sure that we don't lose your questions. So with that, let's get started. So our first guest I want to introduce is Klassie Alcine. Klassie is president of KC Common Good. She brings a wealth of knowledge from her unique background and experience as a political consultant, crisis management expert, nonprofit executive, and entrepreneur. So at KC Common Good's mission is to create an environment where all citizens can live safely and have access to real opportunities. She's a multifaceted public servant dedicated to united communities, joyful leadership, and conscious action for greater Kansas City. She holds a master's in public administration from here at UMKC in the Block School, and one of my very favorite former students, and a bachelor also from UMKC, so a proud Roo. Klassie is an entrepreneurship scholar also at the Rainier Institute here at the Block School, and holds a professional certificate in nonprofit fundraising from the Midwest Center. Welcome, Klassie. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's so great to see everyone's face. Very excited.
Great, great. So let's move on to our next guest. Our next guest is Galen Krauser. Gaylene is the executive director of the Kansas City Indian Center. Prior to her role as executive director, she had a career as a paralegal starting in Wichita, Kansas for a small law firm in federal civil rights, employment, and family law, and then went on to work in a corporate legal department. In Kansas City, she worked in a small firm practicing business and construction law until leaving the workforce to spend 10 years as a stay-at-home wife and mother. During this time, Gaylene was elected to the board of directors of the Kansas City Indian Center, in which she served for more than 4 years, including 3 years as chairman. In 2010, Gaylene returned to the legal field, a small firm near Kansas City, until she began her current position as executive director of the Kansas City Indian Center in June 2012. So welcome, Gaylene.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's move on to our next guest, Alicia Grip. Alicia Grip joined the Citizens of the World Kansas City team, which is a charter school here in Kansas City, in June 2018 as the founding middle school principal, and was charged with leading the fall 2019 middle school launch. In the past year, she worked on hiring the founding staff, family recruitment, and program development. Mrs. Gripp also completed a school launch fellowship through the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition. This is Alicia's 17th year in education. She began her career as a high school English teacher in Raytown, Missouri. There she taught 9th to 11th grade, coached multiple sports, and completed her administrative internship. Alicia served as a building level administrator in both the Independence and Shawnee Mission School districts before coming to Citizens of the World Kansas City. In both of these administrative experiences, she focused on building relationships with families and students, raising student achievement, and reducing the amount of time students spent out of class and or school. Alicia earned a Bachelor of Science in English Education from Northwest Missouri State. She earned a Master's in Education in Building Level Administration and a Ed Specialist certificate in District Level Administration, both from the University of Central Missouri. So welcome, Alicia.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
And Alicia said that she has tried to bar the door to students running in behind her, but for all of us living in COVID, we all know the feeling of having somebody run behind you at any given moment. So,
there could be a child at any moment.
we're so used to it. So, lastly, Keanu Sinks. Keanu Sinks is currently at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here in Kansas City, but by trade is a social and civic innovator, setting the standard for how young leaders should model and action community engagement, bringing forward generations of all sectors of professionals to change the perspective on what community activism should model in our modern day world. Keanu takes pride in giving back. Keanu is a community-minded connector with 10 years of consistent volunteerism and community engagement. She is both mission-driven and passionate about diversity and inclusion and promoting social and civic engagement. During her undergraduate career, Keanu helped spearhead the founding of the inaugural African American Student Union at Central Methodist University. The AASU's mission is to promote positive images of African Americans and stimulate the cultural, intellectual, and social growth of CMU students. Keanu is a student from Jefferson City and was selected as one of the top 10 students by the Jefferson City Mid-Missouri Higher Education Board. So with that, welcome, Keanu.
Thanks, Dr. Never, for having me.
All right. So wonderful. So let's jump right in. Hopefully you all have seen what an exciting panel this group is. Let's start with just sort of some first principles. Today, we're going to be talking about terms such as diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hear these a lot in our dialogues today throughout the region. Could you give us a sense of how you would define those three terms? So I'll throw it out to our panel. Who wants to jump in first? And I am a teacher, so I will call on you if you don't.
Well, I will jump in first. So to me, I always define diversity as the presence of differences. So just different colors, right? Different things. To me, the equity is really around fairness in the distribution of resources. So that's going another layer. And then the ultimate layer to me is inclusion, which is an outcome to ensure that diversity actually feels and is aware that people are welcomed. And I think that requires a degree of decision-making process where everyone is a part of the conversation. So that's how I would define those three terms.
Wonderful. So are there any additions or different sort of ideas from the rest of the panel on DEI?
No, I'll just take it a step further. I think when you think of, emerging leaders and you think about diversity, we oftentimes forget that reflects in age as well. And so during a time where we want organizations and companies and structures to be relevant and to be thriving, we have to make sure we look back. And so when we look around the table and we are diversifying, to Klassie's mention about making sure that those colors are bright and they're strong and they represent all sectors of the community, but also looking at it from an age demographic as well. And so emerging leaders needing opportunities to cultivate relationships, but also making sure that the others in the community, such as other organizations, businesses, are able to maintain different dynamics that are changing day by day as we see. So for example, social media. Now, when you sign for a contract with your company or your brand or whatever, marketing goes hand in hand with that. And so how do we find those ways to obviously stay relevant, but maintain true to diversity, equity, and inclusion that is reflected in those areas as well.
Alicia, you want to follow on?
Yes, and add to, as an educator, we also look at, sometimes in schools, you only look at race. And in my line of work, it's types of learner differences, family structure differences. We have nuclear families, students raised by grandparents, two moms, two dads, and things like that. So one thing we try to do at Citizens is, yes, there's a lot of work to do around race, but there's also a lot of other types of diversity we need to be mindful of and in our work.
I think,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Gaylene, please.
Just going to add that that I feel like the inclusion part is really the one where the work has to be done. You know, where it's almost easier to define, you know, ways people are diverse and that sort of thing. But it's the inclusion part that people really got to reach out in these communities and find these folks and, you know, and make sure that they know that they're welcome and create these spaces where it's obvious that they're welcome. It's one thing to say it, but one thing that people can walk into a space and kind of already feel it.
I think, you know, that's a topic that I want to go deeper in today on authentic inclusion, because it seems like that's really hard, really challenging. So in thinking through, just at the beginning, are there any examples from the panel of maybe a process or something you've seen where inclusion really worked? Right. So you saw a nonprofit or a school or any other structure where you think they actually took this seriously and they got that process right. And you can talk about your own organization, and that's a great thing.
Well, I think
one thing I noticed. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Alicia. You take it away.
We have lots and lots and lots of work to do at Citizens and take it, but I have the unique experience that a lot of building leaders don't have, is hiring the staff from the start. So picking, you know, I didn't inherit anyone, and it all goes, you know, you have to have action plans and audits and all these things to support DEI work, but you have to, my best advice is hire really, really well, because you can teach most of the tasks involved in any job. You cannot teach someone's heart to be open and mindful and carry out the work of DEI. So when I hired, you know, spend a day at the school, you know, talk to students, so people really know what they're getting into before they get on board, because the people carrying out the work, I mean, it starts, it ends, and lives with the team you put around you.
Mm-hmm. And Keanu.
Yeah, I was going to say, many probably have visited the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. If you have not, I would encourage you over the holiday break to bring down your family. But when I think about the game of baseball, oftentimes people think they have to love sports to come there. But what we preference at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is our story is a civil rights story told through the lens of baseball. And so looking at that in its full depth and breadth, and knowing what sports does to society, it brings us closer together. But also at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, simultaneously, as you're learning about the role that Kansas City plays with our own Jackie Robinson. You know, he left the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945 before he broke the color barrier for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so for all intents and purposes, we as Kansas City was the catalyst for social progress in this country. And that is a reflection of what we are championing, and what is so great about the element of our history and how we can take pride in doing so and moving forward. But I think just walking into the museum every day and seeing so many people, whether you are white, Black, Hispanic, just the inclusion piece of people wanting to hear these stories that are drawing people in, and people are listening. And so I think these stories are really resonating at a time where we're not making this up. One thing about Kansas City, all the pieces are present. The people, the community, the work. It's just now, how do we be strategic and align all these pieces together so we can start applying, in my case, the life lessons the Negro Leagues to day-to-day life. And so that's what I see for our community. And it's been very eye-opening to see how a museum and a historical asset plays the role of inclusion every day.
Oh, it's really well said. And, you know, for me, it's a great example of inclusion in terms of sometimes in our minds, and I'll speak for my mind, inclusion can have a particular single dimension to it, right? I work in this community and therefore I want to include this community. And I think what you articulated there is, if for the Negro Leagues, there are many communities you're wanting to bring into the fold, and they all might be approaching this from a different place and a different understanding. Some may be coming just for the baseball, and some may be coming because they're passionate about civil rights or Kansas City history. So I love how you at the museum have multiple touch points to bring people into that conversation. So let's, oh, sorry, Gaylene, go ahead. Yeah.
I just, excuse me. I just wanted to also talk about an experience that I've had recently in working with the Kansas City Museum. And they've recently remodeled and reopened and really took the time to reach into the community and work with different various organizations. But one of the things that they were really good about was that understanding that Kansas City, you know, was here for people before it was actually Kansas City. And they took that time to include that in there. And then they were not afraid to include some ugly truths about our city. You know, I mean, I love Kansas City, but it hasn't always been great for everybody. And including for American Indian people, we were illegal here until 1909. We weren't even allowed to be in Missouri. So they weren't shy to say that. They weren't shy to say, here's who was here. And we dispossessed them of their land. And but here they are now. And a lot of times in a museum, it's just like very, we're behind glass as something that's that is just truly historical. And I think that there are places here in Kansas City, you know, like the Baseball Museum or the Kansas City Museum that really bring that to the present day, you know, so we can see where diverse communities exist in the now, exist in contemporary places. And I think that that's really important, that that we acknowledge history, but we also don't leave people there, that we show where it's gone from there. So anyway.
That's fantastic. And I'm excited to go to the Kansas City Museum after its reopening, and I hear it's beautiful, and it gives me all the more reason to go back up there. So, well, let's move on to maybe some more specific questions for our panelists. So now that we sort of have an understanding of what diversity means in your minds, and equity, and more specifically inclusion. So Keanu, I want to go to you, because one of the exciting things that happened this past week is Buck O'Neil was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. So that's wonderful news, and just so excited to hear about that. Keanu, you also explained in our class last week that Mr. O'Neil missed out on being elected by one vote in 2006, I believe. So let's do a little time machine, Keanu. All right. So if you were to really be able to sit down with Mr. O'Neil and engage him about his career in baseball and civil rights, what might he say about authenticity? Because that's one of our themes today in how we engage DEI.
Man, well, first, it's been a crazy last 40 hours for me. I'm still sleep deprived, to be really quite frank with everybody. What a moment for baseball, for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, for our city. This is our Super Bowl. And so we're really excited about the announcement that took place at the museum this past Sunday. I would say looking at the full body of work for Buck O'Neil and what he stood for that was greater than baseball was just his kindness. You examine that and just the availability to be open and to be transparent with people. And Bob Kendrick, our president, tells this story about Linda Carter, Wonder Woman. And he went to some event that Bob went to years ago with Buck, because obviously, as many people probably know, Buck traveled all across the country to preach the gospel of the Negro Leagues. And Linda Carter didn't know Buck O'Neil, and Buck O'Neil didn't know Linda Carter. But some way, somehow, in the same room, they're in each other's arms and talking and laughing. And Joe Posnanski, as probably many people know, who's probably one of the best writers in the 21st century, said it was just so beautiful to see. And so when you preference that, right, into when we talk about inclusion, not knowing who these individuals are in our community, not knowing, different sectors and different points of what people represent, but accepting them for who they are. I think that goes a very long way in accepting and that taking that first step of breaking down barriers. And I think that's what Buck O'Neil stood for. So being open to change, being the catalyst of change. And I think a lot of that he probably didn't realize at the time that he was doing, but looking back in the common thread that I hear as a young person in our community was just him being open and being available to the community. And so I think for me, authenticity in that is just being true to you and treating everyone with the same respect. And that sounds cliche, but he truly lived a life of kindness. And I think just obviously being a groundbreaking scout for the Kansas City Monarchs, for our hometown Kansas City Royals, becoming Major League Baseball's first Black coach in history for the Chicago Cubs. Then obviously by itself founding the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So when you start looking at the full body of work, obviously that makes him worthy for the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Founding the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum along as one, but I think all of those other noted just so incredible accomplishments in his life with the person that he was adds to all of his great accomplishments that Kansas City got to take a hold of. And I think for me, Dr. Never, and lastly, two people that we don't talk about enough in Kansas City is Mr. K and Buck O'Neil. Black, white, both love baseball, both love Kansas City, both sacrificed so much for our community and gave back tremendously in ways that we will never be able to repay. So from my perspective, we owe those two men a great debt, but I think they're both examples of the courage and the discipline that ultimately here in our community, we would love to reflect. And I think we're seeing that through the Kauffman Foundation, through the Royals, and through the work of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
Yeah, those are just so powerful, your words. And you think through how you walk through the museum. One thing I've been struck by is, you're looking at images of men who are young men. Some of them are 18, 19 years old. And, on one level, they just wanted to play baseball, right? And but on another level, they were pulled into the civil rights story, some wanting to engage that story, and others, begrudgingly have to face that sort of story. And I really appreciate in your museum trying to tease apart that struggle. The fact is that in my mind, this is hard to engage. It's painful to engage in some ways. And to see Buck O'Neil go from being a young man, just being a great baseball player, to really thriving as a civil rights leader too is really impressive. So with that, let me throw out a question that I have here in the chat, which sort of cuts in a separate way, and I'm going to throw it to the panel, and if anybody wants to jump on it, please do. But somebody posted a question to say, difference is natural. We have all sorts of differences, race, creed, gender, and the like. And so the question is sort of on the topic of, why are we pushing so hard towards inclusion when we're also, why should we demonize difference? So, does anybody want to engage on maybe this idea of inclusion may not be an unvarnished great thing? Maybe there are some aspects of inclusion that might not be great.
I don't think DEI work is about demonizing, sometimes feeling more natural with people who are like you. But there's also, the world is, not segregated, nor should it be. Families aren't even segregated anymore. And the work we do is partially, owning who we are as individuals, but then how do we talk about other people's differences in a respectful manner? How can we work together, even though we're very different, students, and produce a product? How, as the leadership team I work with, we have, in addition to race, different backgrounds, different areas of expertise. How do we take that and move our organization forward? So it's not to say I'm not most comfortable with my family who looks like me, but I also have a duty to myself and the world to be able to get along and produce and move work with people who have different backgrounds. And that's what we try to teach the students and our staff.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention, from a KC Common Good point of view, we address a lot about violence in our community. So as we're sitting here, every day I wake up, I read the daily homicide record of our city, and notice that 70% are Black males. And the CDC just gave out a report that homicide ranks #1 as a leading cause of death for Black males ages 1 to 44. So this is why inclusion is important, because we have to address the systematic barriers that have happened, but we also have to address the area of including the most disadvantaged in our communities. And that's why KC Common Good really focuses on youth, really focuses on returning folks coming from the criminal justice system. We focus on veterans, because it is a way to build a high trust culture, which is what we're doing right now, is being as transparent, authentic as we can. But it also is about the action of co-creating policy and programs that are critical to make sure that everyone can be successful. And so I know that sometimes when we talk about DI work, some folks be like, well, I think I'm doing really great. I'm doing really great. My company's really diverse. But the reason why inclusion is so critical is because that's the action piece. That's where the policies come in. That's when you analyze the data and get the feedback from the community. And the data in the community may be saying two totally different things. And that was the basis of KC Common Good. It was, we don't have access to resources. We have a lot of places that there are repeated family trauma within our homes. These are historically built upon situations. And myself being a child of a father who was incarcerated for 15 years of his life, I can tell you collective trauma, racial trauma, it is really looking at those layers and saying, what is the dialogue that needs to happen to shift those things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. So how about let me move on to what you're talking about, Klassie. So KC Common Good, and I've followed KC Common Good because I think so highly of your work, Klassie. And so one aspect is your community connector. So yeah. I think this is exactly what you're talking about. So how about you tease out what this concept is and what you are trying to do?
Back in 2018, American Public Square, which is local nonprofit, KC Common Good is the birth of American Public Square. But the concept was we were bringing together the community around violence. And so American Public Square hosted about 4 events, would everyone care, would anyone show up? And over 1,000 people showed up. And then that's when they knew, wow, okay, addressing root causes of violence is really critical. And so we work with the community through community impact sessions, had a lot of listening sessions, and this common thread kept coming up, which was level one, which was, we don't even know what the resources are. So when you think about access and opportunity, these are things that some of us take for granted. But if you're living in a community where you don't have access to a phone, you don't have access to transportation, that's a huge barrier. So we created the Community Connector. It's a free, anonymous, up-to-date platform that brings together over 10,000 community resources into one place. Because in my brain, you cannot have too many doors. I'm going to open up every single door, and it's powered by United Way of Greater Kansas City 211. But the concept there was the community said, we need something that's accessible. So if someone needs access to potentially life-saving resources, they have direct access 24/7. So it is a platform that's mobile, anyone can use. About 80% of folks use it on their phone. And the key thing there, we've seen it used in real time. We have an example of a gentleman who got out of Jackson County Jail, went to a job fair on the calendar, secured employment. So that is one easy example. We had a coworker whose daughter was dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression, and she connected her to mental health help. We also had a mother who could not pay for the Pampers for her son. She went to Happy Bottoms to connect there. So all these micro shifts of inclusion, right? Because we're including as much as we can. We're seeing these great shifts in experiences for our community. But what is key is that the community voice was first, not last. We usually see these things last. And a lot of KC Common Good's work is, let's go to where the people are and listen, and then just do the action. I know nothing about computers, technology, but you know what? At the end of the day, I know the people who can help me get there. And it's really, I call it that constant mindset of when you start to do the impossible, then it's possible. And that really is the basis of KC Common Good, but also bringing together all these different voices so we can strategically look at what are we going to measure, what is getting out there. So the Community Connector is on kccommongood.org, and anyone can use it. So I definitely encourage folks to share about it, and it can be used on many different levels.
So we have to go there and
Yes.
check it out. And I've been tooling around on it, so
Yes.
I highly encourage people to do that. And so maybe let me go a little bit further, and maybe I'll throw it to Gaylene. But the idea of having a first principle being engage people at the beginning of the process, not at the end. Let them steer the process instead of let the process steer them, right? So Gaylene, though, there's clearly power dynamics in our region, right? I mean, here I am, a white male professor in the ivory tower. There's power involved in that position, as in many of your positions too, as leaders in the community. Could you, Gaylene, maybe speak a little bit to how you see power dynamics intersecting with how you engage folks, and maybe any promising practices of how you empower people to authentically engage, meaning not be tokenized in a process?
That's a big one. I think, well, for us in the American Indian community, like we've already got so much diversity there. I mean, there's 700 federally recognized tribes, 300 languages spoken, just such a diverse group of people to begin with, just among American Indian people. And so we're trying to, of our 11 board members, that's 9 different tribes, and then 2 people that aren't tribal at all. And so just in that structure itself, and in trying to bring people in Kansas City together, there are over 100 tribes represented in Kansas City. So I think for us, we're trying to do that while also engaging with these other power structures in, in the city, in the region, in the nation. And one of the things somebody was asking me about, is just even people like to engage with us in November for November Heritage Month and around Thanksgiving and that sort of time. So I'm super grateful to be here in December and still talking to people, because that's not something that we usually get. It's like we're kind of this thought, around when people wanted to make their little feather headbands in kindergarten, and then, okay, now we've moved on and, the Indian month is over. But we're Indian every day. But people forget to engage with us, that we're just kind of this, like I said, this historical. So when I talk about being included, we're nearly invisible. And that's one of the things that we're fighting all the time as an organization. And so being on panels like this is also important, so people see that we're still here and we're still doing things and we still have contributions to make to the community. And I think one of the things that's been really good for us as a whole as Indigenous people are people like Deb Holland, in these positions, these highly visible positions that are leading changes that are good for our nation and Indigenous people at the same time. But kind of going back to that whole Thanksgiving thing, of the 700 tribes, there are some that are fully like, hey, we're making turkey and we're having, the whole bit, and then there's people that are on Alcatraz Island having a mourning ceremony, and people that are out on the East Coast doing the same on Plymouth Rock. And there's this whole wide variance in between. But I think the biggest thing of it is we're all doing that because our lives are all based on the Gregorian calendar. It goes even that basic. Our months, our years have 13 months in them. When we're thinking about it from an Indigenous perspective, but we live in society in a 12-month year. So we're walking in both of those worlds every single day. Some of us more degrees than others, because some folks are so removed from their traditional knowledge and their Indigenous ways of life for a lot of reasons that, from removal to boarding schools to, being federal crimes to be Indian people. So it's real important for us to be in these spaces of people with power so that we can continue to be who we were created to be.
Right. And Gaylene, we'll have you back as much as you'll allow us. So absolutely. So let me open it up to the rest of the panel too, because I think power is an important concept, right? So the idea is we're going to throw open the doors and be inclusive, and anybody walking in can have a voice. And we also know that sometimes that doesn't work that way, right? I mean, somebody coming off the street with an idea from his or her community is not necessarily going to be welcome open arms in the boardroom that we all, work in. So in your mind, how else can we create that sort of movement of people with authentic feelings, ideas, knowledge, moving that into the organization in across those power barriers?
I really love this question. I have example of a large nonprofit. I was being mentored by this leader, and when George Floyd had happened, she reached out and she's like, Klassie, I feel like I'm doing great, but I don't really know, around DI work. And so I really gave her the assignment to dig deeper and take a deeper dive. So what does that mean? I mean, at the end of the day, power is really around the economics and about the ability to grow wealth. And so what I challenged her to do was actually in her organization is to do a breakdown of her executive leadership, the senior manager level, middle manager level, and then sort of workers and associates. And so she's like, oh yeah, I did that breakdown. And what she noticed was from a diversity point of view, her executive leadership was about 5%, but her workers and associates was at 75%. So then we had a deeper conversation of why is that gap existing? And she really took the time to talk to the folks within the organization through one-on-ones and surveys that came out. But they found this common thread was there was a desire for folks who were the workers to move up in leadership, but were never presented with the opportunity. And a lot of those barriers were the education piece. And so you had a lot of folks who were working 2 or 3 jobs trying to work this job. And so I really encouraged her to see, you know, is there funds in the budget to really help folks who want to move up in that power shift, in that leadership shift. And they actually dedicated 10% of their operational budget to just education and training for their current employees. And to me, that's like ultimate economic inclusion. And when I think about how do we move the power shift as an organization, you have to analyze the data that's coming in, but also go talk to the people. I mean, I don't know what this hesitation is about calling up someone like, you know what, Dan, I don't know who the heck you are, but I appreciate the work that you do. I would love to know your story. And that's building that authentic trust where then power becomes irrelevant, but you're also recognizing that you play a critical role in pushing inclusion within the organization itself.
What a fantastic example, Klassie, of action steps, right? So this is, you know, and having known you for quite a while, Klassie, I also appreciate that you'll be honest with somebody and say you need to do this, and it can be uncomfortable and whatnot, but so essential and a great step. Well, let me before we open it up to everybody attending, please throw your questions in the chat now. This is the perfect time to do it. But I have a question for Alisha. So you were speaking about your families, your kids, your students, and how they represent all sorts of configurations of America. You know, I mean, I don't want to get soapy about it because, you know, it is really such an impressive aspect of education in Kansas City. So maybe if you could speak about how you deal with this idea of difference and inclusion. So I know in your mission statement on your website, you call out the importance of difference and inclusion. And so maybe if you could tease that apart and maybe give examples of how you engage that.
Sure. We're a work in progress, definitely. At the middle school, one thing our students do that is unique to the educational experience of other students is we have a class called Roots, and it's a whole student human class. So they do identity, gender identity, racial identity, socioeconomic. And one of the units they do is called Voices in America. So it's white voices in America, Asian voices in America, in all the right. And then not only do we cram all these students and staff members together and our postcards look pretty, we learn how to talk about difference, like what are proper ways to discuss difference. We don't shy away from it. And we've gotten some pushback. I had a very supportive parent, but he's like, hey, I teach my students, my children not to see race. And I was like, that's great, I can't. And we had a really great, it ended up being a really great conversation. So it's beyond the conversation and the inclusion. I'll be frank, we're still working on. We've done some deep work with the beloved community the last 8 months. And inclusion is our area we need the work in. But our action plan includes us as a leadership team defining what inclusion is. Why, when we did our equity audit, is that the lowest point, and it's consistent with a lot of organizations, but it still doesn't make it okay. You know, why do people feel they belong more than others, in specifics? And another thing, probably, I've been here 4 years, but I've really had the aha moment this year. Part of doing the deep dive into your organization is just listening. Like, you can look at data on a spreadsheet, you can look at survey and all that, but sometimes it doesn't hit you until you see something. We're like, oh man, you know, that's a problem. One thing I did notice this year that I didn't in previous years was middle class white families got access to IEPs, 504s, social service support at a rate faster than students who don't have the advocates to say, hey, my kid needs that. So there's a problem, you know, so then my job is kind of the DEI person for now what are we going to do to level that? How are we looking at all students? You know, yes, we have to listen to our parents and refer, but, you know, are we looking at all students? And we've made some steps. We're working with the Panorama team. But the inclusion work is really just getting in there beyond what the spreadsheet share you. So there's like instances, because I can talk to the team about what data says. I can talk to the team about what spreadsheets, but when I can give a specific example of this child needed support and we did not follow through, this child's mom called and got support in 24 hours, that is more meaningful to or like, oh my gosh, because no one does it intentionally, but it happens and we have to call it out and then make steps to not let that be our culture. If that makes sense.
It makes a ton of sense. So let me follow on just for a second there because this I think is really at the core of I want to learn about, which is how do you sort of normalize this process? Because I can imagine the first time you call out a situation, not an individual, but a situation, it's you know, white knuckles, like, oh my God. How do you then move past that to say, okay, this is a normal thing we do now?
It's about building the culture and trust. And then in my role, being vulnerable as a leader myself, you know, sometimes people of color either put off or other people think like, oh, they don't have bias because they're an identified minority or so I start conversations with, we all have bias of some sort. Mine 2 or 3 years ago was I did not understand mental health around middle class 2-parent households. Like, if you have everything you need, you should be fine. And it took my own daughter having anxiety issues a few years ago. And they're like, oh, 2 parents and having all your needs met. And that's something I've worked with. And then because when I saw it with my daughter, then I'm like, oh my gosh, do I treat students that way? Do I treat students who have it together? Do I minimize their pain over a child I know has 1 parent and not enough food and all that stuff? So I think when I open up with that, and that's my battle, everyone else is like, oh, it's not as yucky if I'm willing to put out there, here's my bias that I have to work on and do work on. Because then everyone else feels safe too, you know, if you kind of throw yourself out there.
And
right.
Dr. Never, I did want to mention a real life experience that KC Common Good has done. It's called Working for Youth. So this summer, in a pandemic, Working for Youth supported almost 500 youth with employment. But this was youth who would never have this opportunity. And the youth who got the opportunity literally said, I can't believe you picked me because I'm not the good kid in the classroom. And I said, we recognize you have gifts and maybe haven't been asked to see what your dream actually is in life. And so we had this premise, could we get employers to step up and provide 8-week opportunities to over 500 youth? And then could we pay them? Because economic inclusion is the really key. If we're not pushing the economics of inclusion, we're not doing our job. I wanted to mention J.P. Morgan Chase actually has an initiative called Black Pathways, where they're investing $30 billion in the next 5 years towards initiatives to support the economic discrepancies and continued systematic issues. But around working for youth, we actually employed, I saw that some folks were talking about trainings, implicit bias trainings, which I think are really critical. But something that we focused on when we talk about the health of our community, mental health is key, social supports is really key. And we actually did trauma-informed care, but the trauma-informed care training was not for the youth, it was for the employers. It's a whole nother way of thinking about flipping the script for folks to understand the awareness and empathy that a lot of our youth are going through. And I think that's why it was so successful. 90% of the youth were of color, 90% want to come back for next year, but also about a quarter of those youth were offered part-time jobs because of their 8-week experience working with employers. And half of those youth were between 14 and 16 years old. So if you go to the people and they told me, Miss Klassie, I want to be off the streets, I want to do something positive, but I don't know what to do. A paid internship where we say we value you goes a lot more further than just standing around and saying the issue's too big, I can't do anything. I don't accept those answers because we all make an impact, and sometimes our silence is bigger. And that's why I encourage folks to do actionable things. It could start with 20 kids that moves on to 50 kids, but just standing around and waiting for folks to get it is not acceptable. We have to move forward with something and get the right people in the room to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Every time you say something, Klassie, it's like, I want to vote for her, you know, but really such great words. You know, it also takes, there's a unique mix. So now I'm going to ask you all maybe a bit about how you see yourselves in these roles of having these conversations, because it seems like on one level you have to be deeply humble, because you have to really want to empathize with people coming through the door, and you check your knowledge at the door because their lived experience is really important. But on the other hand, you have to have a deep sense of yourself in order to be humble, right? Because you have to know who you are and why it matters to actually make that happen. So maybe I'm getting a little personal here, but how have you come to these sorts of positions and these sorts of conversations where you're trying to balance the need to be humble and also the need to really understand who you are?
It's challenging. I mean, every day you wake up and to Klassie and Gaylene point, you try to be you try to bring your best self, but also realizing that a lot of who we are and what we look like and our experiences and coming from Klassie, to her point about economic prosperity, you know, I was one of those kids. And so a lot of people, for me, where I have to put in perspective is I have an obligation to make sure that I do the best that I can, because I have people who look at me, and if I make that mistake, then guess what? Then there's really not a lot of room and growth for maybe someone else who reflects the same role, or who may look like me, or another woman of color, so forth. But I think, Dr. Never, the most important thing that I try to keep in mind is just showing people compassion and grace. I think it becomes really redundant, because I have to tell myself to tell other people that you can't quantify these experiences. We have to consider moving PR to practice. These are just some of the things that I wrote down. Building a roadmap. I have a business partner, Nicole Jacob Sylvia. She talks about that all the time. How is your network working for you? And so a lot of these access to opportunities, well, if you never had those relationships and took the time to pour in them, then when there's a need that arises and you need to address whatever that might be, I might need to pick up the phone and call Gaylene and say, hey, it's March, it's not November, what's going on? And maybe she's able to be proactive in her reach for me of something that I might have, or an opportunity, or vice versa. Those things can happen naturally. But I think for me, Dr. Never, it's just making sure people treat my community with respect. So I'm always, I feel like, correcting and trying to teach people cultural etiquette, and making sure that if you don't do this here, this is unacceptable here. And so just really trying to rewire people, because I think, yes, there is a need for people to want to go out and want to do these things, but also too, you know, the excitement sometimes, you know, is overwhelming because a lot of these people are reaching out, but you don't know what to do. You don't know what to say. And so I think to Klassie's point, it's just creating those opportunities and then and making sure that they're accessible, making sure to Galena's point and to Alicia, she mentioned as well with education, that people have access and understanding about what's happening and how we can take advantage of those.
Again, that's it really self-awareness is really, it seems like in your career, Kiana, has really been important also, and the ability to look at blind spots and to say, you know, I don't know this, but I want to know this. And Klassie, also, I think you were speaking to that impulse. Can I make a little bit of a pivot here? All right. So, you know, this is a glass half empty sort of question. I love glass half full, but, you know, this is obviously, we're all here because it's a very serious subject. Are there any practices in your mind in this area of inclusion or DEI more, you know, expansively, that you find that aren't very helpful, that just haven't worked or just serve to go through the motions, or you know, any examples you've seen where things aren't working, in the intention that maybe we can pick out why it wasn't working and thinking about what would work?
Yeah, something that comes straight to my mind is after George Floyd had happened and all these corporate companies were like, yes, we support DEI, and then crickets, just like, we support it so much, we're gonna put out another statement in a year about how much we still support it. And to me, that's very frustrating. And what's hard when you're talking about race and DEI work is we have to look in ourselves first and understand, like, what is our own personal barrier to not go that extra mile to reach out. And I had a colleague of mine share with me, like, a good way to test that with yourself is look at your phone and look at who you've texted in the last 3 days. And if it hasn't been someone from a different background as you need to be doing your work. And then you have to speak on a principle of value. And people are not feeling valued. That's why we've had this great recession of folks leaving their jobs. It's because folks can say, I believe in this work, but don't put the dollars behind making things better, but instead continue to hold on to power. And so the work of KC Common Good is calling out the policies and calling out the data that proves we should not have a racial wealth gap that's 10 times. We should not have a recidivism rate where 50% of folks who leave prison within a year go back. These are things that disturb my spirit. And I think that that is a practice. A statement is not action. And I've said this very publicly in many different spaces. I do not want another task force, another committee. I want real action that involves a CEO speaking up and saying, you know what, I've done things wrong. How about that? We start with authentic reaction. Because folks don't understand the assignment. The assignment is to show me who you are. If that's ugly, if it's beautiful, but saying, you know, I care so much, I'm just going to ignore it, to me, is where the rubber meets the road and where I decide to go towards the people who actually want to do the work.
Sign me up. I think that's great. Other folks also on the panel, any practices beyond what Klassie illustrated that are, you know, not really moving the ball forward or have challenges? Gaylene?
Well, for me, I think that sometimes when people are thinking about diversity or inclusion, they're just, it's more performative. And they just want some very surface knowledge to say, hey, we did this and maybe check this box, but without actually like doing any homework or finding out anything. Like Klassie said, they don't dig deeper. They don't take the time to find out anything in advance. And we get that a lot about people. Oh, we want to learn about you, but we want you to come and do a powwow dance for us. Do you have any dancers? And we're so much more than that, and I get it. None of this is taught in schools. So any of the ugliness of what's happened to BIPOC people is not taught in schools. And so people really have to go out and do their own homework to find out about boarding schools and redlining and all the ugly that's happened last week, even, because it's not something that's, but then there's also the pushback of people not wanting to teach that, oh, we can't be telling our kids, we can't be teaching this thing that's going to make them not like their country. And so I really feel like just like kind of these like little performances are not really helpful to make any meaningful changes come about.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, it's interesting to hear from our perspective too, Gaylene. We talk about at the museum how we have to literally rewrite history. So none of us during our formal education knew anything about the Negro Leagues, which I find that is crazy. And there were men and women who played in those leagues as well. And every day I'm walking around and I'm seeing this and I'm learning something new that sticks out and how it applies to, everyday just real world issues. And to Klassie's point, like it makes me tear up, because redlining in Kansas City worked, all of these things that, well, why was Black life in 18th and Vine or, East of Truce, those riot divides and all of these different, the Santa Fe Home Association, all of these historical symbols of racism in Kansas City that is still prevalent. And I can't imagine, some of my peers that are older than me, how they must feel culturally and still seeing some of those displays. And not that that's people's intent or they're trying to, put that out there and say, hey, like, we did this and this is here. No, but to be honest, those things are still everyday realities of particular people in which those communities reflect. And so I think for the museum, I'm very well reminded every day, all right, am I going to complain about a Starbucks coffee being late 5 minutes when Satchel Paige had to eat his peanut butter and crackers on the back of the bus? So then you start thinking like, yeah, I got nothing to complain about here. And so just again, just being, on the flip side of just being humble and really putting things in perspective, because I can't imagine, what life was like in Kansas City at that time. But then last but not least, looking at the homelessness in Kansas City and I'll be honest. I mean, you drive by before George Floyd, you know those things are real, but not really taking in the full impact of what that does to our city and to people's lives and how that must be a really challenging thing to deal with. And so I've even found myself like, what there has to be something, surely I'm not the expert here as Klassie as you mentioned on technology and any of these things, but it makes you ponder and think like there has to be more done because every day we see these things, but there's still so much more as a community that we can do together. But there's not one answer in the day. If it was, we would all have it figured out. But I think the power in numbers are beautiful.
It's to tag along with what Gaylene and Keanu said. To look at our history is so powerful because it's literally right here. I grew up in a rural area far from a lot of things that happened in history. For us, you want to see redlining, drive a quarter of a mile from here and you see redlining. You want to see Negro Leagues and the impact of civil rights in you drive 2 miles to go see that, or you want to see what the impact of the Indian Mission was. you drive another mile down the road. It all happened here. It's not this abstraction. Our history is something that not only is something in the past, but as I think you both very clearly articulated, carries through to what's happening today. I do want to get to a great point that Mandy had in the chat. She said authenticity requires courage and vulnerability, which requires safety. Many people don't have that feeling of safety. So maybe Kiana, could you talk about how you use baseball as creating a safe space to then engage a deeper civil rights, discussion?
Yeah, I'll use the pandemic for an example. We know that people of color were highly morally impacted by the pandemic and just COVID-19. And so what the museum did this past year was we partnered with Hy-Vee and hosted COVID-19 vaccination clinics. Now, for us, going to the doctor, a lot of people were okay with that, but also with just the barrier of lack of transportation or just not having access in the community to those resources. And so it was very eye-opening to see how much lighter we got from Johnson County to Leawood coming to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum of that safe haven of a location, just a location change. And so I think that's an example of how we were able to use our institution outside the sports, outside just every other functionalities of our institution and everyday operations, but what are we doing to give back to the community? Buck O'Neill, not on the train, but we had so many other better business propositions for the museum location-wise to be in different places that would have served us much better. But the infinite wisdom said we will resurrect and plant here, and in doing so rebuild this community. And now thousands of people come to the historic 18th and Vine to visit the museums there. And so with that pandemic, and just one example of Dr. Never, seeing how COVID vaccinations and using the museum as a clinic and being served and serving that demographic that was highly impacted, particularly in that zip code, as I learned, was just very touching for me, because I've never seen anything like that, given everything that we all experienced during the pandemic. But it was very eye-opening to see when you make more accessible changes that are outside of structural, like the traditional norm. It amazes me how many people and how much more better impact we have when we're open to just changing and saying, you know what, instead of having this here, let's do it here. And we vaccinated over 2,000 people. And so I don't think we would have done that if we would have not been open to receptive or taken, or said, hey, we want to do this. We didn't have it figured out. We literally were moving things around and trying to do it. But in the end, we served a need. And I think that's an example of how we were able to serve our community in the process of still being true to who we are.
So in thinking about creating those spaces, right? So I'm a geographer, right? I love talking about space and where people are and what people feel about that space. So I won't go into that, but I think you're speaking to that, Kiana. And so let's talk a little bit about creating those safe spaces. So in some ways, as nonprofit leaders, we talk about creating safe spaces. I think Alicia, for example, of creating a safe space to be honest about how we evaluate these kids as they're coming through our doors. And we've spoken a bit about how you do that. How do we also create safe spaces for people of the community to also engage with us? And it's daunting, right? A lot of us represent institutions. I'm in a higher ed institution. Sometimes we have these conversations of, why don't people just come ask us more for help? And it's like, well, we got big walls and gates and key card doors. Maybe there's a reason why they don't come ask for our help. So how do we create those channels or pathways that are very safe to do that? And I'll just say one that I like here. One model is really leveraging clergy. Some of our great churches have been great gateways. You know, people feel safe with their clergy member, and that clergy member has been a great pathway for us at UMKC. That's the go-between. So that's an example. But do you see other examples of how we create that safe space? Oh no.
I'll bite.
Okay.
Well, I think like for us, I talk to my staff, and that's really where it starts is, I think kind of circling back to the very beginning, it's, who's in your organization, who's representing you, and what they put out there, and that energy that they put out there. But there's not, I tell them, you might be the only American Indian somebody ever meets. And so I know that's a lot of pressure and it's not right, but it's true. And so anytime that we're in the community doing a panel like this, in a school, in an event, anywhere, they have to remember that they might be the only person. So, act accordingly. Yeah. And but I think that when we go out and we do events, and we like to participate in other people's events, because then when we're removed from our spaces, because people don't necessarily want to come to the Indian Center, they might not feel welcome. They might be like, oh, or even we just had a powwow over the weekend, and we don't get a lot of people that aren't Indian come to our powwows. Even when we say, hey, everybody's welcome, they feel like they're intruding on something because they don't really understand it. So we don't get a lot of people coming to that. But we'll go to other events, and we'll go to other people's things that are more open to the community, and table at other places, so people can get little samples of who we are before they like come to our spaces that they may feel a little more uncomfortable with. So I think that like those power in numbers, going into these places like the Ethnic Enrichment Festival every summer in Swope Park, where people can come and, we have presenters and we share our food, and, we have folks there that people can talk to and do a little educational piece. It makes them more comfortable and coming and talking to us the next time.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So kind of chopping up that experience, so it's not this daunting, come in and answer for your collective history of as white Americans and engage us. It's more of you have pathways to engage folks on terms that are a little bit more approachable for them. So here, Angela, you have a question you just posted. So Black progress as a group in areas such as marriages, businesses, home ownership has declined, not improved after integration. Has or will diversity and inclusion result in significant improvement? So I think this is a very real question, right? Which is, we've had many discussions over many years, some more authentic than others. And what's to say that this discussion, not here today, but our societal discussion is actually going to be fruitful? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we're working with a model called the Empowerment Network from Omaha, Nebraska, who has dealt with the same sort of statistics listed. But what they found in that the root of all of this is economic. And I say economic a lot because it's about show me the money and then invest the money strategically. And with KC Common Good, in my personal position, is that we have a lot of regional things, right? But we really need to hyper focus. So a lot of our work focuses on the 6 zip codes east of Truce that have the lowest life expectancy rates, because we recognize that if we provide and infuse more capital, we'll get a lot more bang for our buck for everybody. And I was interviewed for an article a couple of months ago, but this gentleman had said to me, like this idea of how much would it cost to fix this problem, right? And I always say the problem is the economics of it. But if you've been disinvesting, right, through redlining, many things, millions, if not billions of dollars into an area, guess what? It's going to take just as much effort to reinvest into those areas too. So I think that there has to be this larger conversation of following the money to understand what people value, and really standing up and saying, you know what, violence prevention in our region is the lowest supported area, though it's the number one issue for our community. And it's going to take a critical mass of community coming together and saying, we've had enough of this, and then pushing forth a process where we can help folks process trauma. We can help folks get actual sidewalks on their streets. Like, this is outrageous. You walk in some parts of our city, you can't even walk down the street. Like, this should be like base level kind of stuff. So I think that at the end of the day, addressing access to education, to transportation, all these lead to upward economic mobility is how we have to do it. But we also have to have a critical mass of support from everyone to make this a hyper focus and not let up until it's done.
Yes. Yes. So in that vein, in thinking about bringing people to the table, right? We talk about that. That's one of our, terms we use, bringing people to the table. We had a great question, which is, we have existing tables in this city, right? I mean, there's some big funder tables, right? There's some cultural institution tables. There's all sorts of tables to which I'm not invited, or you may not be invited. How do we co-create new tables? Meaning, how do we create this idea that this table has not been working for us? This process has not worked. Here's the new table. And this is, if you sit here, this is what you're sitting down to. Any ideas of how you set that new table, how you bring people to that new table?
Yeah, I mean, the outcome of KC Common Good is essentially that table. So it's bringing together all these different voices in a really strategic way. And the model that we're working with in Omaha has convened over 3,000 groups. And we can do that here, right? But it's the idea of being consistently showing up for each other, consistently focusing on the solutions, not so much the problems, because I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time in what's wrong, but seeing what we can create together that can push things in a way that's really effective. But it's having that open communication. It's looking at the actual process and making sure that we're playing roles in designing those solutions, but also building trust. And I think that's a piece that wasn't talked as much as I would love it to be talked about in these spaces of, when folks say, well, I want a seat at the table, my response is, you don't need a seat, you create the table. And that's the mindset I think about every single day. And so if that table is, who's missing? Maybe that's where it starts. Who's missing? Okay, let's call them. Hey, can you come join us? And 100% of the time, they're going to tell you yes, because no one's ever asked them to be included. And that's the power of creating these safe spaces, is being able to open up and ask that person, hey, can you join me on this? We don't really know everything that's going on, but we know that your voice is missing. And I think that's the trust and transparency that we need to see, and then to consistently do it. And that's the part that a lot of groups forget. So they may meet every quarter, right? How much progress can you push through in a quarter? Not a lot. But how much progress can you push through if you're meeting, every week? Wow, that's a lot more solutions to be had and tracked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love the idea of consistency. I think is really important. These systems were not built in a day, and in a brown bag lunch or a navigation series, they will not be fixed, right? So how do we consistently, hammer away at this and create that trust? Because these are difficult discussions. And if you just drop in and drop out, that's not going to create that trusting relationship where we all have to sort of, roll up our sleeves and engage. Well, and on that note, it's really so hopeful to talk to all of you. I really want to thank Gaylene, Alicia, Keanu, and Klassie for being so excellent at really giving us great examples of promising work in the region. Such strong words. I know I'm going to reflect on this for quite a while. What I do want to say in the theme of being consistent is this is going to be a consistent theme for our navigation series over the next year. We want to serve as one of the many conveners in this region around this discussion. And so again, thank you so much to our panelists. I think we all deeply appreciate your wise words. I do want to say that we have an evaluation of feedback form that Mark has just put in the chat. It's so important to us to understand what resonates with you, what would be better next time. We take those every time and try to build on what we did. And lastly, if you have ideas about other voices that we should be bringing in, please let us know, because this is one of our passions, is to really bring in those voices. As Klassie finished with, how do we have those people here in the discussion, because we learn something new every day. So with that, everybody, thank you again. Please have a wonderful and happy holiday, and we'll see you after the break with our next session.